Nobody in Harper County remembered the Morrison farm for the crops it once grew. They remembered it for the men it destroyed. Old-timers swore the land had a curse on it. 3 different families had tried to make a living from those 80 acres. One lost the farm, one lost his marriage. The last one lost everything except the clothes he wore to the auction. People stopped calling it the South Field years ago. To everyone in Harper County, it was simply the cursed field. On a cold Saturday morning in March of 1988, nearly the entire county gathered inside the livestock auction barn to watch that field change hands one last time. Nobody came expecting to buy it. They came for the entertainment. The auctioneer shuffled through the final stack of papers before holding up the deed. "Last item of the day," he called through the microphone. 80 acres, Morrison South Tract. A few people laughed before he even announced the opening bid. Everyone knew which field it was. Everyone knew its story. The auctioneer smiled. "Let's see if anybody's brave enough today." He started at $50 an acre. Silence. 25. Nothing. 15. Not a single bidder raised a card. Someone near the coffee table shouted, "Throw in the tractor, and maybe I'll think about it." Laughter rolled through the barn. The auctioneer looked down again. "All right." He shrugged dramatically. $8 an acre. Even he couldn't keep a straight face. 80 acres. $640. Who's feeling lucky? The room went completely quiet. Not because anyone was thinking about buying it, because everyone was waiting for someone else to make the first joke. Then, slowly, a worn hand rose into the air. Bidder 47. Every head turned. Walter Brooks, 62 years old, a widower, owner of 120 modest acres north of town. He still drove a faded 1958 Ford pickup that rattled every time it crossed the railroad tracks. His farmall tractor was older than some of the farmers standing inside the barn. He had never been rich, never wanted to be. People respected Walter. At least, they used to. Since Ruth died 6 years earlier, people whispered that something inside him had changed. He isn't the same man. Grief got to him. He spends too much time alone. Now they watched him holding bidder card number 47. The auctioneer blinked. "Walter, you serious?" Walter nodded once. "I'll take it." For a heartbeat, the barn fell silent. Then the laughter exploded. Richard Hale nearly spilled his coffee. The biggest farmer in Harper County slapped the shoulder of the man beside him. "I knew it! I told you somebody was finally crazy enough." More laughter followed. Richard owned nearly 4,000 acres. Brand new John Deere equipment. Center pivot irrigation. A grain operation people from neighboring counties came to study. Everything Walter wasn't. Richard walked across the aisle until he stood directly in front of Walter. He smiled the way successful men smile when they know the room belongs to them. "Walter, you don't have to do this." Walter looked at him. "I already did." Richard chuckled. "No, you just embarrassed yourself." He pointed toward the deed lying on the auction table. "That land buried 3 families. You planning on making it 4? The crowd laughed even harder. Walter said nothing. Richard stepped closer. "You know what your problem is? You think hard work fixes everything. It doesn't. Sometimes dead things stay dead." Walter never answered. That somehow annoyed Richard even more. Before he could speak again, Milton Crane stood up, president of Harper County State Bank, the man who financed half the farms in the county. He walked toward the auction table and picked up Walter's deposit check. He studied it for several seconds before looking over his glasses. "Walter, I can't accept this." The laughter stopped. Walter frowned slightly. "Why not?" Milton smiled. "Because I already know what's going to happen. You'll buy this field. You'll lose every penny you've got. And 6 months from now, you'll be sitting in my office asking for a loan." He held up the check. "I'm saving both of us the paperwork." Without another word, he tore the check clean in half. Gasps filled the barn. Then someone laughed. Another joined in. Within seconds, the building shook with laughter. Richard slapped his knee. "There it is. Best thing I've seen all year." Even the auctioneer couldn't hide a grin. "Walter, I think that's your sign to head home." Richard leaned close enough that only Walter could hear him. "You should have stayed with your little farm. Men like you don't rescue land. We buy it after you fail." Walter looked down at the torn pieces of paper lying on the auction table. For several seconds, he didn't move. No anger, no argument, no embarrassment. He simply reached inside his old denim jacket, pulled out a thick brown envelope wrapped with 2 faded rubber bands, and placed it quietly on the table. The auction clerk opened it. His eyes widened. He began counting. 20s, 10s, 5s, 1s, bills so worn they had clearly been saved for years. The room became quieter with every stack. 100, 200, 400, 500, 600, $640. Exactly. No loan, no check, no debt. Cash. The clerk looked at the auctioneer. It's all here. Nobody laughed anymore. Walter slowly picked up the torn pieces of his check, folded them once, slipped them back into his pocket. Then he looked directly at Milton Crane. You were right about one thing. Milton forced a smile. Oh? I don't owe the bank a dime. Walter signed the deed, folded it carefully, placed it inside his jacket, then started walking toward the exit. Just before he reached the door, the auctioneer raised the microphone one last time. Ladies and gentlemen, his grin returned. Sold. To either the bravest, he paused as the room waited, or the dumbest man in Harper County. The barn erupted once again. Walter never looked back. Outside, a cold Kansas wind swept across the gravel parking lot. His old red heeler, Amos, stood beside the pickup and wagged his tail as Walter climbed into the driver's seat. He started the engine. The truck coughed twice before settling into its familiar rumble. As he pulled away, laughter still echoed from inside the auction barn. Walter rested one hand on the steering wheel. The deed lay on the passenger seat. He glanced at it only once, then turned west toward the field everyone believed was cursed. He had no idea that the humiliation he had just endured would soon become the smallest price he would pay for that land, because before anyone in Harper County would ever admit they were wrong, Walter Brooks would lose almost everything he had left. Walter reached the field just before sunset. The wind had picked up, dragging thin sheets of dust across the road. He parked beside the south fence, stepped out, and stood there for a long moment without moving. From a distance, the land looked worse than it had from the auction barn. The ground was gray, not brown, not black. Gray, like ash after a fire. The last Milo stalks from the Morrison farm stood ankle-high and brittle. A row of cottonwoods leaned along the creek bed, half dead and stripped by years of wind. In the low spots, white crust showed through the dirt. Salt. Walter opened the gate. Amos slipped through first. The dog wandered a few yards into the field, sniffed the ground, then looked back as though even he had questions. Walter knelt and pushed a screwdriver into the soil. It stopped after less than 2 inches. He moved 10 feet and tried again. Same result. He took a folding shovel from the truck and dug into the surface. The top layer broke apart like powder. Underneath was clay packed so tight the shovel blade rang against it. Walter lifted a clod, held it to his nose and smelled nothing. No earth, no roots, no life. He walked toward the low ground where water had once collected. The white crust was thicker there. He scraped it with his boot and watched the salt crumble. For the first time that day, doubt crossed his face. Maybe the men at the auction were right. Maybe some things really had been ruined beyond repair. Then Walter went back to his truck and pulled an old map from behind the seat. The paper was yellowed and held together with strips of tape. It had belonged to his father, who had worked on a county soil survey before Walter was born. Walter spread the map across the hood. Near the Morrison property, someone had written 3 words in pencil. Deep prairie loam. Walter looked from the map to the field. This land had once been good, not average. Good. Before the plows came, prairie roots had reached deep into the ground. They had opened channels for water, held the soil against the wind, and fed everything beneath the surface. Then the field had been worked too hard for too long, plowed deep, left bare, compacted by heavy machinery, asked to produce year after year without being given anything back. Walter folded the map. The ground isn't dead, he said. Amos tilted his head. It's tired. Walter looked across the field one more time. Then he added quietly, I know something about tired. The next Monday, he walked into Harperville Feed and Seed. Conversation stopped the moment the door opened. Milton Crane stood beside the coffee pot. Richard Hale leaned against the counter in a clean work shirt, talking about the new John Deere tractor he had ordered. When Richard saw Walter, his smile returned. Well, look who it is. He raised his coffee cup. Harper County's newest land baron. A few men laughed. Walter ignored them and walked to the seed counter. He ordered annual rye, sweet clover, daikon radish. Bobby Dean, the young clerk, looked at the list twice. You planting pasture? No. Hay? No. Richard stepped closer. What are you planting, Walter? Roots, Richard laughed. Roots? Walter nodded. Roots. Richard turned toward the men by the coffee pot. You hear that? He bought 80 acres of cursed ground so he could grow roots. Milton took a drink. Maybe he's planting a garden for his grave. The room filled with laughter. Walter continued stacking seed bags. Richard watched him for a moment, then lowered his voice. You know what people are saying about you? Walter did not answer. They say Ruth's death changed you. Walter's hands stopped. Richard saw it, so he pushed harder. They say you bought that field because you've been alone too long. Walter slowly turned. Richard smiled. Maybe you thought the ground would talk back. Nobody laughed this time. Even Milton glanced away. Walter looked directly at Richard. The ground doesn't need to talk. His voice was calm. It just needs to be treated right. He paused. Something you haven't learned in 30 years of farming. Richard's smile disappeared. What did you say? Walter turned back to Bobby. Add a roll of barbed wire. Then he counted out cash. Richard stepped closer. You think paying cash makes you smarter than everybody else? Walter slid the money across the counter. No. He picked up the first seed bag. But it keeps men like Milton from tearing up my plans. The room went silent. Milton's face turned red. Walter carried the seed outside. By noon, the story had reached the diner. By evening, half the county was saying Walter had finally lost his mind. The following morning, he brought his 1956 Farmall 400 to the field. Its red paint had faded almost pink. One fender was dented. A length of baling wire held the battery cover shut. Richard slowed his pickup on the county road. He rolled down the window. That tractor belongs in a parade. Walter kept filling the drill. You need something real. I'll rent you one. Walter climbed into the seat. I already have something real. Richard shook his head. You'll be lucky if weeds grow. Walter started the Farmall. The old engine coughed twice, then settled into a steady rhythm. He drove into the field. For 2 days, he planted rye, clover, and radish across all 80 acres. Then he waited. The spring rain came late. When it finally arrived, most of it ran across the hardened surface and collected in the low ground. Half the seed never came up. What did emerge looked thin, pale, and uneven. From the road, the field appeared worse than before. Within a week, someone placed a hand-painted sign near the co-op scale, Brooks Botanical Garden. Underneath, someone else added, Admission, $8 an acre. Walter saw the sign when he came for fencing staples. Men near the scale watched him. He read it once. Then he walked past. Richard followed him inside. You know they're laughing at you. Walter examined a box of staples. Sounds like they're having a good time. You don't care? Walter looked up. Would caring improve the soil? Richard frowned. What? If I get angry, does the ground get better? Richard shook his head. You always were strange. Walter placed the box on the counter. At least I remember who I am. Then he looked at Richard. Do you remember who you were before everybody started calling you successful? Richard's expression hardened. Walter paid and left. At the field, he cut the rye before it went to seed and left it lying on the surface. He did not bale it. He did not plow it under. He spread manure from his cattle lot. He hauled old straw from a neighbor's barn. He repaired a broken terrace along the north slope. He planted windbreak trees. Every job took time. Every job cost money. None of it produced a crop. By the end of the first year, Walter had spent nearly $2,000 on land that had returned nothing. His daughter Elaine found the receipts on the kitchen table during a Sunday visit. Dad, this has to stop. Walter poured coffee. It will. When? When the field is ready. Elaine stared at him. You've spent more fixing that land than you paid for it. That isn't unusual. You're using money from the cattle. I know. What happens when that runs out? Walter looked through the window toward the barn. We'll handle it. Elaine lowered her voice. People are saying you've lost your judgment. Walter turned back. People said your mother was foolish for planting cottonwoods, where the wind would break them. Elaine looked toward the trees Ruth had planted 20 years earlier. They now protected the house from winter storms. That was different. Most things look different before they work. Elaine pressed both hands against the table. This isn't about the field anymore. Walter said nothing. This is about Mom. His eyes moved toward the window. Elaine sat down. Dad, you couldn't save her. Walter's jaw tightened. I know. Then why are you trying to save a piece of dirt like it's going to change that? Walter stood very still. For a moment, Elaine thought she had gone too far. Then he sat across from her. When your mother got sick, everybody told me to prepare for the end. Elaine looked down. The doctors said 6 months. She lived 4 years. Because she was strong. Walter nodded. And because we kept showing up. He looked at his hands. I fed her. Drove her to treatment. Sat beside her when she couldn't sleep. His voice weakened. I kept giving her what I could, even when I knew it might not be enough. Elaine's eyes filled. Walter looked toward the south, as though he could see the cursed field through the wall. When I stood on that land, I didn't see something dead. He swallowed. I saw something that had been used until there was nothing left. Elaine reached across the table. Walter continued. I couldn't save Ruth. His voice broke. But maybe I can prove that being exhausted isn't the same as being finished. For a long time, neither of them spoke. That night, Walter opened a soil report from Kansas State University. He had collected samples from 12 locations. The results were worse than he expected. Organic matter averaged 0.6%. Water infiltration was less than a quarter inch per hour. The upper soil was severely compacted. Several low areas showed elevated sodium. At the bottom of the report, the technician had written, "Significant remediation required." Walter underlined the words. Then underneath he wrote, "Not impossible." The second year, he planted deeper-rooted covers, alfalfa, sweet clover, sorghum sudangrass, sunflowers. The county laughed harder. At the Harper County Fair that July, Richard sponsored the equipment exhibit. His new John Deere tractor sat beneath polished lights near the entrance. Beside it stood a large painted sign, "Farm Smart, don't farm like Walter Brooks." Below the words was a cartoon of an old man driving a broken red tractor through a field of weeds. People stopped to take pictures. Some laughed. Children pointed at it. Daniel saw the sign before Walter did. He was 14 now. Grandpa, Walter looked toward the exhibit. Richard stood near the tractor, shaking hands and smiling for the crowd. When he noticed Walter, he stepped onto the small platform and took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, look who came to inspect real equipment." The crowd turned. Walter stopped. Richard pointed toward the cartoon. "Walter, we saved you a place." Laughter spread across the fairground. Richard continued. "Maybe next year we'll add a competition for tallest weeds." More laughter. Daniel's face turned red. "Grandpa, let's go." Walter remained still. Richard leaned into the microphone. "How's that $8 paradise treating you?" Walter looked at the sign, then at Richard. "It's teaching me patience." Richard smiled. "At your age, I'd be asking it to hurry." The crowd laughed again. Daniel clenched his fists. Walter placed one hand on his shoulder. "Keep walking." They moved through the crowd. Behind them, the laughter followed. Daniel looked up at him. "How can you let him do that?" Walter kept walking. "Because he needs the crowd." "What does that mean?" Walter glanced back at Richard standing beside the new tractor. "A man who knows he's right doesn't need a microphone." That night, Walter stood alone in the cursed field. The sun had gone down. The county fair lights glowed faintly in the distance. He could still hear pieces of music carried by the wind. He looked across the thin cover crop, then down at his boots. For the first time since buying the land, he wondered whether silence was strength, or simply another name for being too proud to admit defeat. The county fair came and went. For most people, it was another summer weekend filled with barbecue, tractor pulls, and blue ribbons. For Walter Brooks, it became the day Harper County stopped laughing behind his back and started laughing to his face. By the time August arrived, the story had spread far beyond Harperville. People from neighboring counties drove past the Morrison place just to see the crazy old man trying to farm cursed ground. Some slowed their pickups, some honked. A few even stopped long enough to ask if the weeds were for sale. Walter answered every question the same way. "They're working." Most people laughed before driving away. The second growing season started better than the first. The rye established quickly. The clover spread farther than expected. Even the radishes pushed thick white roots deep into the compacted ground. For the first time, Walter allowed himself to believe the field might actually be changing. Then, in early May, everything changed. The weather radio began warning of severe thunderstorms. By late afternoon, the western sky had turned almost black. Wind screamed across the prairie. Amos crawled beneath the porch. Walter stood at the machine shed, watching clouds roll toward the farm. Then the hail started. Not marble-sized, not golf ball-sized, baseballs. Ice exploded across the roof of the barn like shotgun blasts. Windows rattled. Tree branches snapped. Walter could do nothing except watch. 20 minutes later, it was over. The silence afterward felt almost worse. Walter drove to the south 80 before sunrise the next morning. His stomach tightened the moment he stepped through the gate. Nearly every young plant had been shredded. Leaves lay scattered across the ground like wet paper. The rye had been beaten flat. The clover was torn apart. The sunflowers looked as though someone had run them through a grinder. Walter slowly removed his hat. For several minutes, he simply stood there. No anger, no shouting. Just silence. He knelt and picked up a broken sunflower stem. It crumbled between his fingers. Almost 18 months of work, gone in 20 minutes. Behind him, another pickup stopped along the road. Richard Hale climbed out. He didn't even bother hiding his smile. Rough morning? Walter kept looking at the field. Richard walked through the broken plants, kicking one aside with his boot. I've been saying it since the auction. He looked across the ruined acres. Some land doesn't want to be farmed. Walter finally looked at him. Hale doesn't choose fields. Richard shrugged. Maybe, but bad decisions usually do. Walter said nothing. Richard laughed softly. You know what the difference is between us? When my crops fail, I've got enough land to survive. He looked around. You? You just lost almost everything. Richard climbed back into his pickup and drove away. The dust from his tires drifted across the broken field long after he disappeared. Walter stayed until sunset. He counted surviving plants, measured damage, made notes in his notebook. Then he drove home without saying a word. That evening, Elaine arrived unexpectedly. Someone in town had already told her about the storm. She found Walter sitting alone at the kitchen table. His notebook lay open beside a stack of unpaid bills. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Elaine reached across the table. Dad, I think it's time. Walter didn't ask what she meant. You've proved your point. There isn't anything left to prove. Walter stared at the bills. You still have your own farm. You still have the cattle. You can walk away. Walter slowly shook his head. If I walk away now, the field learns nothing. Elaine's eyes filled. Dad, the field doesn't care. I do, Walter whispered. She looked at him for several seconds, then quietly asked, Or are you still trying to save Mom? Walter closed his eyes. Neither of them spoke again that night. A week later, the bills came due. Seed, fuel, repairs, property taxes. Walter counted every dollar in the kitchen. It wasn't enough, not even close. The next morning, before sunrise, he loaded 6 cows into his old livestock trailer. The oldest one was a red Angus named Molly. Walter had raised her from a calf. She had survived blizzards, droughts, and coyotes. She always walked beside him without needing a rope. When the trailer gate opened at the sale barn, Molly refused to move. Walter rested one hand against her neck. It's all right, girl. She still wouldn't step forward. The buyer became impatient. You gonna move her? Walter nodded. But instead of pushing, he scratched the white patch between her ears one last time. You took good care of us. His voice almost disappeared. Now I need you to do it one more time. Molly finally stepped down the ramp. Walter never watched her leave. He signed the paperwork, folded the check, walked back to his pickup. Inside the cab, for the first time since Ruth's funeral, Walter cried. Not because of the cows, not because of the money, because for the first time since buying the field, he wasn't sure he was doing the right thing. That night he sat alone on the porch. The house was quiet. The barn felt empty. The wind moved softly through the cottonwoods Ruth had planted years earlier. Walter held an old photograph in his hands. Ruth was standing beside the garden, smiling into the camera with dirt on her gloves. He traced the edge of the picture with his thumb. I couldn't save you. His voice cracked. I tried. God knows I tried. He looked toward the darkness where the cursed field lay beyond the hills. And maybe Richard was right. The words hung in the night. I've spent everything. My savings, my cattle, my pride, and I still don't know if I'm helping that land, or burying myself with it." He lowered his head into his hands. For a long time, there was only the sound of the Kansas wind. Just before sunrise, Walter was still sitting on the porch when footsteps approached. Daniel climbed out of his mother's car carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He didn't say anything at first. He simply sat beside his grandfather. After several minutes, Daniel spoke. "Mom said you sold Molly." Walter nodded. "I had to." Daniel looked toward the fields. "Does that mean you're quitting?" Walter didn't answer. The boy reached into his backpack and pulled out something folded in half. It was a picture he had drawn at school 2 years earlier. It showed Walter standing in the gray field. At the bottom, written in crooked handwriting, were 6 words. "Grandpa fixes things nobody else can." Walter stared at the drawing. Daniel smiled. "I figured I'd better give it back." Walter looked at him. "Why?" "In case you forgot." For a long moment, Walter couldn't speak. Finally, he folded the picture carefully and slipped it inside his shirt pocket, right beside the deed to the cursed field. Then he stood up. He looked east as the first sunlight spread across Harper County. The field was still wounded. His bank account was nearly empty. Half the county still believed he was a fool. But something inside him had changed. He picked up his work gloves, looked at Daniel, then smiled for the first time in weeks. "Come on." Daniel stood. "Where are we going?" Walter looked toward the South 80. "We're going to feed the soil. And this time, we're going to do it right." The next morning, before the sun cleared the horizon, Walter and Daniel were already standing in the middle of the South 80. The air carried the cool smell of dew, but the field still looked tired. Broken stalks from the hailstorm lay scattered across the ground. Daniel looked across the damage. "Where do we even start?" Walter bent down and picked up a handful of flattened rye. "By leaving it." Daniel frowned. "You don't want to clean it up?" Walter shook his head. "No. This isn't trash anymore. It's armor." He spread the dead plants across the soil with his boot. "Every stem keeps the sun off the ground. Every leaf slows the wind. Every root feeds something we can't see." Daniel nodded slowly. "So even dead plants still have a job." Walter smiled. "The best workers usually do." For the next several weeks, they worked almost every day. They spread compost. They reseeded the worst areas. Walter repaired erosion channels left by the storm. He stopped plowing completely. Instead of turning the soil over, he let the earth stay as undisturbed as possible. People driving past couldn't understand it. The field looked messy, untidy. Nothing like Richard Hale's perfectly straight rows. One afternoon, Bobby Dean pulled his pickup onto the shoulder. He climbed out and looked across the field. "I've got to ask." Walter leaned against the shovel. "What? Are you actually trying to grow something? Or are you just experimenting?" Walter smiled. "I'm growing patience." Bobby laughed. "You can't sell patience." Walter pushed the shovel into the soil. "No, but you can lose a farm without it." Bobby drove away, shaking his head. Walter returned to work. By late summer, tiny changes began appearing. Not the kind anyone noticed from the road. The kind only someone who looked every day could see. One afternoon, Daniel knelt beside a patch of clover. "Grandpa?" Walter walked over. Daniel carefully pushed aside the mulch. A single earthworm disappeared into the soil. Daniel looked up. "I've never seen one here." Walter crouched beside him. Neither of them spoke. The earthworm wasn't important by itself. What it represented was. Walter gently covered the soil again. "They're coming home." Daniel smiled. "Who?" Walter looked across the field. "Life." A month later, the first measurable rain arrived. Just under an inch. Walter and Daniel stood near the north fence watching dark clouds drift away. Across the road, muddy water poured from Richard Hale's freshly worked cornfield into the ditch. Walter looked down. Very little water was leaving his field. Most of it had disappeared beneath the residue. Daniel noticed it too. "Grandpa, it's soaking in." Walter nodded. "It finally has somewhere to go." That evening, Susan Bell from the county extension office stopped by. She had heard rumors that Walter's field was handling rainfall differently. Susan was young, recently hired, and unlike most people in Harper County, she hadn't grown up listening to stories about cursed land. She carried a soil probe, a notebook, and more curiosity than skepticism. You mind if I take a look? Walter handed her a shovel. Go ahead. Susan pushed the probe into the ground. It slid nearly 6 inches before meeting resistance. She looked surprised. This report says this field was almost impossible to penetrate 2 years ago. It was. She took another sample, then another. She rubbed the soil between her fingers. It feels different. Walter smiled. It is. Susan looked around. What exactly are you doing out here? Walter shrugged. I'm feeding things nobody sees. Susan laughed softly. That's not exactly a scientific answer. Walter looked at Daniel. My father used to tell me something. Susan waited. Take care of what's underneath, and what's above will take care of itself. Susan wrote the sentence down. Before leaving, she asked one more question. Do you think this field can ever produce a profitable crop? Walter looked across the 80 acres. I don't know. She seemed surprised by the answer. You've spent 3 years rebuilding it. Walter nodded. I can't control the harvest. I can only control how I treat the soil. Susan smiled. I hope you're right. So do I. As Susan drove away, another pickup pulled onto the road. Richard Hale. He had watched the entire conversation from a distance. He stepped out wearing polished boots that had never seen much mud. So now you've got government people studying weeds? Walter continued repairing a fence. Richard folded his arms. I heard you've been showing people earthworms. Daniel looked up. There weren't any before. Richard ignored him. He looked directly at Walter. You know what I think? Walter kept working. I think you've convinced yourself little changes matter because you've got nothing big to celebrate. Walter drove another staple into the fence. Richard smiled. My corn's over 6 feet tall. You've got worms. He laughed at his own joke. Walter finally looked at him. How deep are your roots? Richard frowned. What? Your corn. How deep? Richard shrugged. I don't know. Walter nodded. That's the problem. Richard climbed back into his truck. As he drove away, he shouted through the open window. Harvest settles every argument, Walter. Walter watched the dust disappear down the road. Then he quietly answered, though Richard was already gone. It usually does. Summer rolled into another brutally hot August. Day after day, temperatures climbed above 100 degrees. The ground baked beneath the Kansas sun. The weather radio repeated the same forecast every morning. Hot, dry, windy, no significant chance of rain. Farmers began looking toward the sky instead of their fields. Richard Hale wasn't worried. Not at first. His irrigation pivots stretched across thousands of acres. His wells had always carried him through dry summers. This year would be no different. Or so he believed. One afternoon, while checking fences, Walter noticed something unusual. Richard's biggest irrigation system wasn't moving. The long steel pivot stood frozen in the middle of a cornfield. The next day, it still hadn't moved. Then another. Walter didn't smile. He knew exactly what it meant. The well wasn't keeping up. 3 days later, Richard drove into town with dried mud covering the side of his truck. He walked straight into Harper County State Bank. Milton Crane greeted him with confidence. That confidence disappeared after Richard spread his financial records across the desk. I need another operating loan. Milton read the papers. You've already borrowed against next year's crop. I know. My irrigation isn't keeping up. Milton leaned back. How bad? Richard hesitated. Bad. Milton looked through the office window toward Main Street. What about insurance? It won't cover this. Silence filled the room. Finally, Milton closed the folder. I'll see what I can do. Richard nodded, but neither man looked convinced. Outside, Walter drove slowly past the bank on his way home. He noticed Richard's pickup parked outside. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the windshield. Neither man waved. Neither man smiled. Both of them understood something neither had been willing to admit 4 years earlier. The drought had finally arrived. And before it was over, Harper County would discover whether the old stories about the cursed field had ever been true. Within 2 weeks, Harper County no longer talked about the drought. They talked about survival. Every morning the local radio station repeated the same sentence, another day above 100 degrees. Every afternoon the wind carried another layer of topsoil across the county roads. Ponds shrank, creeks disappeared, pastures turned the color of old rope. The corn that had looked so promising in June now curled its leaves before noon, trying desperately to hold on to what little moisture remained. Farmers stopped talking about yields. Now they talked about losses. Walter drove through town one afternoon and noticed something he had never expected to see. The coffee crowd inside Harperville Feed and Seed was quiet. No jokes, no laughter. The men who had once laughed at his cover crops now sat staring at weather maps taped to the wall. Even Richard Hale wasn't smiling anymore. He stood near the window, talking in a low voice with two neighboring farmers. Lost another well this morning. Pivot shut itself down. Corn's firing all the way to the ear. Walter walked in carrying 2 sacks of mineral for his remaining cattle. Nobody noticed him. That alone told him how serious things had become. Bobby Dean looked up from the register. "Morning, Walter." Walter nodded. "How's business?" Bobby forced a smile. "Mostly people buying hope." Walter looked around. "I don't see any on the shelves." Bobby let out a tired laugh. If somebody could bag rain, they'd own Kansas. Walter paid for the mineral and started toward the door. Richard called after him. "Walter?" Walter stopped. For a moment neither man spoke. Finally Richard asked, "How's your field?" Walter answered honestly. "Still hanging on." Richard studied him. "No irrigation?" "No." "No new well?" "No." Richard frowned. "Then how?" Walter looked toward the dry fields outside. It kept what little rain it got. Richard shook his head. "That's impossible." Walter rested one hand on the door. "No. It's just slower than people like." He walked outside before Richard could answer. Richard stood there watching the old pickup disappear down Main Street. For the first time in his life, he wasn't laughing at Walter Brooks. He was wondering if the old man had been right all along. 3 days later, Susan Bell returned. This time she wasn't alone. 2 agronomists from Kansas State University climbed out of the extension truck, carrying soil probes, moisture meters, and clipboards. Walter met them beside the south gate. Susan smiled. "I hope you don't mind. I invited some people." Walter looked at the group. "What for?" Susan answered without hesitation. "Because nobody believes me." One of the professors introduced himself. "We've been comparing moisture reports across the county." He pointed toward Walter's field. "Your numbers don't make sense." Walter smiled. "They make sense. They're just inconvenient." The professor laughed. "We'd like to find out why." Walter stepped aside. "Then let's go digging." For nearly 2 hours, they sampled the field. 8 inches, 12 inches, 16 inches. Every sample told the same story. There was still moisture beneath the surface. Not a lot, but enough. Across the county, neighboring fields had become hard as concrete. Walter's soil still broke apart in dark, crumbly pieces. One professor held a handful beneath his nose. "It smells alive." Walter nodded. "It finally is." Susan compared moisture readings from Walter's field with those from Richard Hale's cornfield, less than 2 miles away. The difference stunned everyone. Walter's field held almost twice as much available water. One professor looked at Walter. "You haven't irrigated?" "No." "You haven't subsoiled?" "No." "You haven't applied synthetic soil conditioners?" Walter smiled. "I planted roots." The professor chuckled. "I think we're going to need a better scientific explanation than that." Walter looked down at the handful of soil. The roots did what steel couldn't. They opened the ground. The worms kept opening it. The residue kept it cool. The rain finally had somewhere to stay. Nobody spoke for several seconds. One of the younger researchers quietly said, "So the miracle started 4 years ago." Walter shook his head. "No, it started 40 years ago." Everyone looked confused. Walter pointed toward the horizon. "The miracle would have been taking care of it before it was broken." News travels quickly in small farming communities. By the end of the week, people were driving past the South 80 again. But this time, they weren't laughing. They were stopping. Some climbed the fence just to scoop up a handful of dirt. Others simply stood there looking across the field, trying to understand why Walter's sorghum still held its color while everything around it slowly turned brown. Even the local newspaper printed a photograph under the headline, "Can a cursed field survive the drought?" Richard clipped the article and left it on his kitchen table. He read it 3 times. Each time he became more uncomfortable, because every sentence reminded him of something he had laughed at. Cover crops. Residue, roots, less tillage. Everything Walter had done, Richard had mocked. That night he drove alone to the edge of the South 80. He stayed inside the pickup for nearly 15 minutes before finally getting out. Walter was repairing a section of fence. Neither man spoke. Richard walked into the field. He knelt, picked up a handful of soil, then looked at Walter. "I've farmed my whole life." Walter nodded. "I know." Richard slowly rubbed the soil between his fingers. "I've never seen ground feel like this." Walter walked over. "It wasn't always this way." Richard looked across the green sorghum. "I thought you got lucky." Walter smiled faintly. "So did everybody else." Richard stood. "I need you to tell me something." Walter waited. Richard took a long breath. "When did you know?" Walter looked out across the field. "I didn't." Richard frowned. "What?" "I never knew. I only believed." Richard stared at him. "You risked everything, without knowing?" Walter nodded once. "I knew how healthy soil behaved. I knew this ground used to be healthy. I believed it could become healthy again." He paused. "But belief isn't the same thing as certainty." Richard lowered his eyes. For the first time in years, he realized Walter Brooks had never been gambling. He had simply been more patient than everyone else. Walter looked at Richard. "The question isn't whether your fields can recover." Richard looked up. "It's whether you're willing to stop treating them like mines and start treating them like farms." Richard didn't answer, because deep down, he already knew the answer. The only thing he didn't know was whether he had waited too long. Farther down the road, a cloud of dust rose behind another pickup. Milton Crane was coming toward the field, and for the first time since tearing Walter's check into pieces 4 years earlier, the banker wasn't arriving to laugh. He was arriving because the numbers on his desk had become impossible to ignore. Milton Crane parked his gray sedan beside the county road and sat behind the steering wheel longer than he intended. 4 years earlier, he had walked into an auction barn convinced he understood the value of land. Now, for the first time in his banking career, he wasn't sure he understood it at all. He climbed out carrying a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. Walter looked up from the fence he was repairing. "Morning, Milton." The banker nodded. "Morning." The greeting felt awkward. Neither man mentioned the auction. Neither mentioned the torn check. Milton walked into the field, stopping every few yards to look at the sorghum. The plants weren't perfect. Some stood shorter than normal. Others leaned slightly from the wind, but they were alive. All around them, fields that had looked stronger in June now rattled with dry leaves. Milton finally spoke. "I've been reviewing operating loans." Walter waited. "Nearly half the farms I financed are going to miss their payments." Walter drove another staple into the fence. "I heard." Milton looked across the field again. "And yours?" Walter smiled. "I don't owe anybody." Milton nodded slowly. "I remember." The words hung between them. For several seconds, neither man said anything. Finally, Milton took a long breath. "I shouldn't have torn up your check." Walter looked at him. "No, I shouldn't have." Milton lowered his eyes. "I wasn't trying to humiliate you." Walter didn't answer. "I honestly believed I was protecting you." Walter rested both hands on the top of the fence. "And now?" Milton looked across the field. "Now I think I was protecting my own opinion." Walter smiled gently. "That happens more often than people realize." Milton opened the leather folder. Inside were photographs of dozens of failing farms across Harper County. Brown corn, dry wheat, abandoned pivots. Then he pulled out one final picture. Walter's field, green, alive. "I've spent 30 years judging land by appraisal reports." Milton quietly admitted. "You judged it by what it could become." Walter shook his head. "No, I judged it by what it needed." Milton closed the folder. For the first time in years, he felt like the student instead of the expert. Underscore. The drought continued into September. Every passing week widened the difference between Walter's field and almost every other farm in the county. People no longer drove past to laugh. Now they parked along both sides of the road. Some walked into the field with notebooks. Others brought cameras. Teachers from the local high school began bringing agriculture classes to see it. Walter answered every question the same way, patiently, without once mentioning the auction, without reminding anyone how they had treated him. Daniel noticed. One evening, while they repaired a gate, he finally asked, "Grandpa?" Walter looked up. "Why don't you tell them?" "Tell them what?" "How they laughed. How Richard treated you. How Milton tore up your check." Walter hammered another nail into the post. "What good would it do?" Daniel shrugged. They'd feel bad. Walter smiled. I don't need people to feel bad. I need them to farm better. Daniel thought about that for a while. So, you already forgave them? Walter looked toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. No. Daniel frowned. No? Walter shook his head. Forgiveness isn't something you announce. It's something you practice. Harvest arrived during the second week of October. Word spread quickly that the Harper County Agricultural Association would announce the county's official dryland yields during the annual harvest banquet. Normally only farmers attended. This year, nearly everyone came. The banquet hall filled an hour before the program began. Extension agents, bankers, reporters, equipment dealers, families, even people who had never planted a crop in their lives wanted to know whether the stories about Walter's field were true. Richard Hale sat near the front. His face looked thinner than it had during the summer. Milton Crane sat alone several rows behind him. Walter chose a seat near the back of the room beside Daniel. He had no expectation of hearing his name. To him, the harvest had already answered every question that mattered. Susan Bell stepped onto the stage carrying a thick envelope. The conversation slowly faded. She smiled at the crowd. This has been one of the most difficult growing seasons Harper County has experienced in decades. No one argued. She continued. We've lost crops. We've lost income. And some families here will face difficult months ahead. The room remained silent. But tonight, we also recognize something remarkable. She opened the envelope. Several people glanced toward Richard. Most assumed the county's biggest farmer had still managed the highest yield somewhere among his thousands of acres. Susan looked down, then back up. The highest profitable dryland sorghum yield in Harper County. She paused, long enough that the entire room leaned forward. Goes to Walter Brooks. Silence. Absolute silence. No applause, no whispers, only disbelief. Daniel looked at his grandfather. Walter hadn't moved. Grandpa? Walter blinked. I think they're talking about you. Susan smiled from the stage. Mr. Brooks, would you please come up here? Walter remained seated another moment, almost reluctantly. Then Daniel gently touched his arm. You've earned this. Walter stood. The room watched him walk slowly toward the stage, past Richard, past Milton, past the same people who had laughed at the auction 4 years earlier. Susan handed him the plaque. Before she could step away, someone near the back began clapping. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet. A standing ovation. Walter looked out across the crowd. Not one face was laughing. Some were smiling. Some were crying. Richard remained standing too. His hands came together slowly. Not because losing suddenly felt good, but because denying the truth no longer felt possible. Susan leaned toward the microphone. Mr. Brooks, I think everyone would appreciate a few words. Walter looked at the audience, then down at the plaque. Finally, he stepped toward the microphone. I've been thinking, the room became perfectly still, about something my father told me when I was a boy. He paused. He said, if you only take from the land, eventually, the land has nothing left to give. Walter looked around the room. I think the same is true for people. Nobody moved. He continued. 4 years ago, people told me this field was cursed. He smiled softly. They were wrong. The field wasn't cursed. It was exhausted. It had been asked to give, long after everyone stopped giving anything back. He looked toward Richard, then toward Milton. And the truth is, sometimes we do that to people too. The room fell silent again. Walter lifted the plaque slightly. I didn't win this because I'm smarter. I won because the soil taught me something. He smiled. What you care for will usually care for you. He stepped away from the microphone. The applause this time lasted even longer, not because of the yield, because everyone in that room understood. Walter Brooks hadn't just restored a field, he had restored something inside the people listening. As the applause slowly faded, Richard remained standing. He watched Walter leave the stage without celebrating, without boasting, without reminding anyone how wrong they had been. At that moment, Richard realized something that hurt far more than losing a harvest. Walter had defeated him, without ever treating him like an enemy. When the applause finally began to fade, Walter quietly handed the plaque back to Susan. She looked surprised. I think you'll want to keep this, she whispered. Walter smiled. I came here to farm, not to collect trophies. Susan laughed softly. I had a feeling you'd say that. She handed it back anyway. This one belongs on your wall. Walter accepted it only because refusing again would have embarrassed her. As he stepped off the stage, people began moving toward him from every direction. Farmers, reporters, students, even neighbors who hadn't spoken to him in years. Everyone wanted to shake his hand. Everyone wanted to ask the same question. How did you do it? Walter answered each person exactly the same way. I didn't fix the field. I stopped hurting it. Richard waited until the crowd became smaller. Then he slowly walked toward Walter. For a moment, neither man spoke. Richard looked older than he had only a few months before. The drought had carved deep lines into his face. Pride had done the rest. Finally, he held out his hand. Walter looked at it, then shook it. I owe you an apology, Richard said quietly. Walter nodded. I know. Richard almost laughed. I figured you'd make me say more than that. Walter smiled. I already heard the important part. Richard looked around the room. I spent 4 years trying to prove you were a fool. Walter didn't deny it. I laughed. I mocked you. I made that sign at the county fair. I told people you were growing weeds. He lowered his head. And I was wrong. Walter rested a hand on Richard's shoulder. Being wrong isn't the problem. Richard looked up. Then what is? Staying wrong. For a long moment, Richard couldn't answer. Finally, he asked the question that had been sitting in his heart for months. Would you teach me? Walter studied his face. The arrogance was gone. The confidence that had filled every room Richard entered had disappeared. In its place stood a tired farmer who honestly wanted to save what he still had left. Walter nodded once. Monday. Richard blinked. Monday? 6 o'clock. Bring work gloves. Richard smiled for the first time in weeks. I've got plenty. Walter smiled back. Good. Leave your pride at home. Richard laughed. This time, Walter laughed too. Milton Crane. Waited until Richard walked away. Then he approached slowly. I suppose it's my turn. Walter looked at him. Milton reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Carefully, he removed a folded piece of paper. Walter immediately recognized it. The check. Or rather, what remained of it. Milton had taped the torn pieces back together. I kept it. Walter looked surprised. For 4 years? Milton nodded. I don't think a day went by that I didn't remember tearing it apart. He handed it to Walter. I can't undo what I did, but I'd like you to have it back. Walter unfolded the check. The tape had yellowed. The tears were still visible. He looked at it for several seconds, then quietly folded it again. Instead of putting it into his pocket, he handed it back. Milton frowned. I don't understand. Walter smiled. You keep it. Milton looked confused. Why? So the next time someone walks into your office with an idea nobody else believes. Walter paused. You'll remember this before you tell them they're wrong. Milton's eyes filled. He slowly nodded. I will. I promise. The story of the cursed field spread farther than anyone expected. First across Kansas, then into neighboring states. Agricultural magazines wrote about Walter's farm. Universities invited him to speak. Television reporters wanted interviews. Walter accepted very few. Whenever someone asked why, his answer never changed. I've got chores. Susan Bell laughed every time she heard it. You know most people would love this attention. Walter looked across the pasture. Most people don't have cattle waiting on breakfast. The following spring, Richard arrived exactly as promised. Monday morning, 6 o'clock. Not in his new pickup. In the oldest truck he owned. He wore faded jeans, old boots, work gloves. Walter noticed immediately. You left the pride home? Richard smiled. I'm trying. Walter pointed toward Richard's north field. Good. Today, we're planting something that won't make you $1. Richard laughed. Last year I'd have called that crazy. Walter picked up a seed bag. I know. The bag was filled with rye and clover. Richard looked at it. So, this is where it starts? Walter shook his head. No. It started the day you admitted you didn't know everything. They worked side by side until sunset. No audience, no reporters, no applause. Just 2 farmers walking behind an old seed drill. Daniel watched them from the fence. Susan stopped by in the afternoon and smiled. You know, this might be my favorite part of the whole story. Walter looked up. Why? Because this. She pointed toward Walter and Richard working together. is the harvest. Walter looked across the field, then at Richard covering seed with the old farmall. Finally, he nodded. I think you're right. Underscore. Over the next 10 years, Harper County slowly changed. Not all at once. Field by field, farmer by farmer, cover crops became common, deep tillage became less common, more residue stayed on the soil, wind erosion decreased, water stayed where it fell. The county extension office eventually nicknamed the Morrison Place the Second Chance Field. Walter never corrected them. He liked the name, because it wasn't only the field that had been given another chance. Richard rebuilt much of his farm, not as large as before, but healthier. Milton Crane changed the way he evaluated agricultural loans. He began asking farmers about soil tests, crop rotations, and conservation plans before discussing machinery. Daniel studied agronomy at Kansas State University. When people asked why, he always gave the same answer. My grandfather already taught me the most important lessons. I just wanted to learn the vocabulary. Walter laughed every time he heard it. Underscore. Years later, on Walter's 81st birthday, Daniel drove him to the south, 81 last time. They parked beside the same gate Walter had opened on the evening he bought the property. The cottonwoods were taller now. The creek carried water again after spring rains. The soil beneath their boots was dark, soft, and alive. Walter slowly walked into the middle of the field. He knelt with some effort, scooped up a handful of earth, then closed his eyes. He smiled. It smells right. Daniel knelt beside him. It does. Walter gently let the soil fall through his fingers. You know, when I bought this place, I thought I was saving a field. He looked across the waving sorghum. It turns out, the field saved me. Daniel swallowed hard. Neither of them spoke again for several minutes. The Kansas wind moved through the crop with a soft whisper, almost like the prairie itself was saying thank you. Walter stood slowly, brushed the dirt from his hands, and together, grandfather and grandson walked back toward the old pickup. Behind them, the field that Harper County had once called cursed stretched to the horizon, greener than anyone alive could remember. Some people later said the greatest miracle Walter Brooks ever performed was bringing dead ground back to life. The people who truly knew him understood something different. Walter never performed a miracle. He simply gave the land what everyone else had stopped giving: time, patience, respect, and the courage to believe that something exhausted was not the same thing as something lost. Maybe that's why people still tell the story. Not because a 62-year-old farmer bought 80 acres for $8. Not because he harvested more grain than anyone expected, but because in the end, he proved that the things the world calls worthless are often the very things waiting for someone willing to care for them. And perhaps that's true of people, just as much as it is of the land.